Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Shanna Pagem, and I am the conference host, and I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Rogan Kersh today as our keynote speaker from Wake Forest University. And we have to say thank you to the Oxford Book Publishers for arranging this opportunity for us. And I can say thank you to Dr. Kersh for being so flexible. We had originally had a plan for him to be with us in person, but of course things changed and he's been extremely adaptable, and we appreciate that. Dr. Kersh from Wake Forest University is Provost and Professor of Political Science at the university. He is a leading scholar in American political science. Dr. Kersh is best known for his work on health reform, obesity politics, and interest groups and lobbying. As a political science faculty member at Syracuse from 1996 to 2006, he won 3 different teaching awards. From 2006 to 2012, as Associate Dean of New York University's Wagner School of Public Service, he won both the Wagner and NYU Teaching Awards, as well as the Martin Luther King Jr. Award for Scholarship, Teaching, and University Service. Dr. Kersh has published 2 books and more than 50 academic articles, and has provided commentary on U.S. politics for dozens of different media outlets, including CNN, Newsweek, and the New York Times. He was president of the American Political Science Association's organized section on health politics and policy in 2011 to 2012, and is an elected fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration. And so here today, Dr. Kersh is going to tell us everything we didn't already know about the presidential election. And we're so glad that he is here to share with us today.
Thank you so much, and what a joy to be with new friends and some I've known for a while. Sean, great to have Pi Sigma Alpha represented on here. Thanks so much for being here as well. And oh my gosh, I have a scratchy voice because 2 nights of next to no sleep, partly following these extraordinary races all over the country, as I know you all are, and partly the book that I hope at least some of you are using on American government, the one Jim Marone and I do for Oxford University Press, by the people. We are, I think, one of just a couple of the political science American government textbooks that actually includes the election results when it comes out in late December. So we hold the book open and hold space to write the election results. So normally we'd have it done by now, 2 hard days of work, but there's still so much we don't know. Let's dive in. I'm going to share my screen if that's okay, for those of you who have screen access, and walk us through this most extraordinary of elections. And let me say first that I'm not going to spend the whole time on what the counts look like in Georgia right now, et cetera, although we'll do a little bit of that. I want to talk some about the keys to this election as best as we're able to tell early on. Talk some in the context of 2020, in the context of really quite an extended period of a particular style of party engagement. And in general, try to offer some political science insights, many of which are contained in our book, and carry us through that way. Thrilled to engage with you guys all as we go along, and also I'll save plenty of time for your opinions and ideas, because we all are experts on this most fascinating of subjects. I will start with the paths to victory. I put this together election night, and it astonishingly hasn't changed all that much. That is the states that are most at issue here. This is where we stand still now. You're well familiar with this, I'm sure. The brown states or gold states, I guess, are the ones that haven't decided. I went ahead and gave Alaska to Trump, even though they haven't finished, because he's so far ahead. It votes a bit like Oklahoma, very strongly Republican. Specifically, I should say, actually, how delighted I am to be with friends and new friends from Oklahoma. As I was saying to our chair before we started, my grad school best friend and longtime housemate was from Ponca City. So I've been there a number of times. And I had, when I was a baby professor at Yale, we had a visiting faculty member, some of you may know, Michael Mosher, who was at Tulsa for many years, and a dear friend as well. And then I come to Oklahoma City on a regular basis for a whole variety of reasons. So it's really good to be in your state, as it were. And I'm just incredibly discouraged that we are doing this over Zoom, but that's where we are. All right, this is where we are presidentially, unless something's changed in literally the last 6 minutes. I checked just before coming on. For Trump to win, I think again, I'm going to state more or less the obvious, but get us all on the same page. For Trump to win, he's got to run the table The only state he can afford to lose of the open ones at this point is Nevada. Let's give Nevada to Biden, where he's ahead, and give everything else to Trump. And you can see Trump winds up winning by 20 votes, 20 electoral votes, which will look to somebody far distant from now, our students, a generation from now, like, oh, he won pretty handily. But we know what an extraordinary and tight race it was. I should note, of course, that if Trump wins electoral college and loses the popular vote, he'll again repeat his once unicorn event in American history. Although we've had a number of such elections in recent years in our students' lifetimes, say, as you know, an interesting feature of American politics at this time. Biden's got more paths to victory. He, for example, if you give him the places that he's now got a narrow lead in voting, as best as we can tell, not North Carolina, but give him those yet to be decided states of Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, and Pennsylvania, you can see he wins over 300 electoral votes. He'll have a 74 vote margin, which is reasonably comfortable, actually. He'd have with that the 22nd highest electoral vote total ever in American presidential history, 58 presidential elections. Of course, that's an odd statistic because we only got a 270 margin and only to that 540 total in relatively recent, 538 total in recent years, of course. Still, though, it'd be a reasonably comfortable margin, somewhere in sort of a middle of the American pack. There's also a route Biden has that if he loses Georgia, loses Pennsylvania, loses North Carolina, but wins Arizona, he will win the presidency with the barest of margins, 270, 268. And if you're not been following this as obsessively as I think most political scientists and even citizens are, you'll know that what made the difference, astonishingly remarkably, is Nebraska. I'm sure, but I'll remind us all that in all but 2 states in the country, electoral votes are winner take all. You win the popular vote, you get all that state's electoral votes. For not that long, actually, Maine and Nebraska have been the 2 outliers there. Back in 1972, before that election, Maine shifted to the congressional district method, as they called it. 2 electoral votes go to the state popular vote winner, and then 1 goes to each congressional district popular vote winner. In Maine, with 2 districts, that means 2 go statewide and 2 go to the districts. You can see it on the lower right in the key on that map. That question mark just tells you details of what I'm telling you now. And then Nebraska, some years later, 20 years later, in 1992, they followed suit. I remember being, teaching political science at Yale back then, actually, and suggesting this might be the wave of the future. In 92, we had a second state do it. Well, no one's done it since. Nebraska has 3 congressional districts, as you guys know. So there's 2 statewide, which Trump wins easily, won the popular vote in a big way, and 2 congressional districts that Trump won big, but there's 1 in the Omaha and its suburbs that Biden has won. Actually, since 1964, there's only been 1 Democratic winner anywhere in Nebraska, and that's when Obama won that same second district, Omaha and its burbs, back in 2008. So I go into this in so much detail because it's an extraordinary artifact of American electoral history. If Trump had won, if it turns out this close, and the states fall as I've suggested here, which we all know is possible, if Trump had just put, I don't know, 1 more day into the Omaha area in Nebraska, he'd be the president. It comes down to something that close. Astonishing feature of our elections. And let's pull out the paths for Biden and Trump and how this might play out and so on. We'll all watch the counts as they come down. And who knows, before 1 o'clock your time, 2 o'clock mine, we might have a winner that we can announce right on here. Let's put 2020 in context for a moment. That's an incredibly close possible outcome. And here we are, 2 days after Election Day, still counting ballots. We've got this incredibly close sort of 50-50 election. And the question is this normal? This election, I think because of Trump himself and COVID, all the swirl around this, everyone's calling it the most unusual, unique, strange election that we've ever seen, et cetera. It's actually kind of a normal election in contemporary times. Let me lay out how I think that's the case. High turnout, that's good news. You can see Trump's been coming up since the early 1990s, latter 1980s, when a lot of us were writing, as young political scientists then, we're writing about the end of American turnout and how can we get people to the polls and how this is the highest turnout in 120 years. So quite remarkable in that regard. And that's reflects the fact that with more people in the country, you get more popular votes. If you take the last 12 highest popular vote getters, they're all this century, with the exception of Ronald Reagan, who, as you can see, down at number 9, or if you don't do a tie at 8, number 11, 54.5 million. I show you that just to say that more of us cast ballots because it's a larger population than ever in the country's history. And what's interesting and odd, though, is that we cast those ballots in enormous numbers, almost exactly divided 50-50. We are in the most extended period of close presidential and, for that matter, midterm congressional elections in the nation's history. To illustrate that for you, let's look at the winners' percentage of the popular vote and who won the most going back 100 years to 1920. You can see LBJ there at the top. This is the post-Kennedy election, of course. He consolidated power in a short time and swept to the largest popular vote margin ever. And if you look across this list, I've taken everybody who got over 53%, which is a pretty comfortable win. That's the kind of election that if you lose, the other side got 53%, you go back as the losing party, you lick your wounds, you reconvene, you might even reform things, you might throw out some of the longtime leaders and replace them and so on. That's, again, a pretty standard election in American life. In fact, in every decade, starting in 1920, we had at least one and sometimes 2 or 3 such landslide or at least large presidential win elections. They're standard in American history. They come along almost like a forest fire, clearing out lots of the underbrush and partisan differences and so on. And again, sending the losing party home to lick its wounds and really reform its ways. None of those elections have happened since the 1990s began. We had a very close 1992 race, split 3 ways, of course. And since then, apart from 51 or 52% Obama margins, we've had elections that were incredibly close. And notice the dynamic when we political scientists are trying to explain it. I'll circle back more to why they're so close, although it's mostly guesses hazarded so far. But note the fact of it, because what this endlessly close 50-50 style elections generates is not a kind of, if not a whole realignment, the way we political scientists talk about it, at least, again, a chance for consolidation, moving forward for the victorious party, and serious soul searching and reform and change in the losing party. What happens instead when you lose by a few thousand or a few, 100,000 popular / a few electoral votes in either case? What happens then is you stay in the arena. You're furious. You think the election was stolen. If only Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, 70,000 votes total in 3 states, all the recriminations and infighting and so on. The Democrats didn't step back after 2016 and examine the state of their soul. I mean, Democrats can't do that anyway, but they didn't step back and say, what's wrong with our party and why aren't we appealing to American voters? They stayed in there and fought. And the same thing will happen after 2020. We're already hearing about, should Trump eventually concede, how he goes off and forms a television station and lobs grenades at the folks in power, Biden and on across. That's the nature of 50-50 elections. And it's been that way for nearly 30 years in American life. And that's a very long period for a 50-50 period. As you can see, go back 100 years, you see those kinds of underbrush clearing elections steadily. What that leads to is lots of questions and trying to make sense of it. These are sociologists rather than us political scientists venturing into this turf. But election after election, we all are trying to make sense of why they're so close. It also creates or helps fuel the tremendous polarization we see in this. A lot of time on this. This is an economics assessment, but if you look at the red line and the green line, what you're seeing is 2 different measures of polarization. There's an enormous increase since really low levels in the 1970s on both those dimensions. A strange shift in 2000 that was a unicorn of an election. But otherwise, you just see these numbers going up. You see the nature of our polarized society. In that way, I want to emphasize, without beating this horse to near death, that 2020 looks like a pretty normal election in what my co-author Jim Morone and I are calling increasingly a party system unto itself since the early 1990s. I mean, it is a very closely divided, endlessly contested battling. Americans haven't become more partisan just ipso facto, we aren't somehow culturally different from our predecessors. We just don't have the kinds of elections that give us a chance to step back and say either we won big and forward we go, or, we got the tar kicked out of us and we're going to go figure out what went wrong. Sometimes in midterms that happens, but not the presidential level, which is where it really matters. And so we're trying to explain it. Economists are trying to figure out, does race have something to do with it? As more African-American candidates run, at least the claim here, which has not been replicated fully well. Some of you probably do research related to this and know better than I, but following the research through, the theory here is that African-American and white candidates running against each other tend to generate very close elections. One tiny part of a very large and complex story, election bias at the 50-50 rate. This is a elaborate, again, sort of political economic attempt to explain the basic dynamic I've just described. So this feels like it's baked in as a feature in American electoral life, as you all know so well. When something's been baked in for 3 decades, it's about time for it to change, but this election will not mark that change. A second interesting feature and key to understanding this election. The way the demographics look like, you all have heard a lot about Hispanics in Florida. Let's take a look, stepping back slightly. We don't have great numbers yet, but we've got pretty good exit poll numbers, and happily the exit polls include early voting. So the usual folks who do this work at Edison and working with the major networks have, I think, done a pretty good early job of giving us a sense of demographics. Forgive me if you've absorbed all this information already. I'm doing my best to make sense 2 days after, and let's take a shot. We know that in significant numbers, almost everywhere in the country, except in the bluest and reddest states like yours, or on the blue side, Greenwich Village, for example, and New York, more broadly where I come from, moderates really shifted to Biden this time. They were more evenly divided in 2016. The moderate vote, it was Fox affirming yesterday that, quite a thoughtful piece actually, that Trump was seeing, as you can see, support from the base, but moderates had moved to Biden. And Fox and others have noted this is happening all over the country. Again, moderates voted slightly more Democratic in 2016, but one reason Trump may wind up losing this election or Biden winning it is because Biden attracted more of the moderate vote. There is this claim again that, especially early on when it looked like Trump was repeating the 2016 success because of Florida being declared early, and this, not that Latinos voted as a majority for Trump in Florida, they didn't, but the astonishingly small margin compared to most previous Democratic candidates going back a ways has led to say, oh, Latinos have shifted Republican in decisive ways. Not so nationally. In Arizona, for example, there's, as you can see from this particular headline, also published election also yesterday, we've seen different kinds of Hispanic shifts or Latino voter shifts in different parts of the country. And it's reflected here's the overall numbers. This again is exit poll, pretty close to accurate. What you see among Latino voters nationally is a kind of, and they started out some years ago, as again, you all do this work and teach these classes, you know this as well. Latinos used to vote at higher rates, on average, on balance, for Democratic candidates. They've looked more like other immigrant groups in American history, who typically go back a century, Irish or Italian or Asians, you can see here, start out voting more Democratic typically, and then particularly as they move into the middle and upper middle class, as a whole, you see a shift towards the Republican Party. The one group that's not made that shift at really any election in modern American history is African Americans. But Latinos, rather than bizarrely being courted by Republicans, there's lots of writing out there already, really are looking more like familiar immigrant group trends in American history. And some of the folks in our discipline who work on Latino voters are emphasizing that finding or feature. So this is not where I would lead my lecture on what happened this election, that Latinos suddenly broke for Trump in ways we didn't understand. It's only in Florida, it turns out, in a significant way. Gender gap, this does seem to have been big. We saw big gender line splits, including in the all-important suburbs. We often know how rural and city voters are going to break in large numbers, so suburbs matter in recent elections at least. Here's your gender split. Men very slightly favoring Trump. It was a larger margin in 2016. Women by 13 points. It's not the biggest gender gap we've ever seen, but it's not as big as it was in 16. Female candidate which Hillary Clinton at the top of the ticket would certainly help. But it is a vast margin, which will have a lot to do with explaining how this election came out. Those of us who teach in universities, that is to say all of us, who teach young people, and I know that some of our schools, it's a mixture of older and younger students, but we're around these young voters a lot. And man, I mean, both political scientists and pundits since 2008 especially, the first real millennials, as we were defining them at least, first real election in which millennials could vote was 2008, and the claim everywhere was that they were going to lift Obama to victory. And on election night, a lot of turned out to be spurious writing said they had lifted. Well, they didn't vote in very large numbers. They did break for Obama, but they didn't vote very large. African Americans made much bigger difference to his outcome. And year after year, I do something with my students when I lecture on presidential elections and their generation. And I show headlines each year, both national and midterm, 08, 10, 12, 14. Always, this is the year that young voters will really matter. It's like Lucy holding the football for Charlie Brown. It turned out they were right, finally, in 2018. We saw a decisive move to the polls by young voters. The point, again, is not that they they do, millennials and the rising Gen Z, if you accept that term, do prefer Democratic candidates by and large, by significant margins. They just don't turn out much. But they turned out in 2018, and they seem to have turned out in a big way in 2020. They also, it's an early piece without a lot of data behind it, but we start to see a lot more organizing activity, organizational engagement by young people. That had been a worry for those of us who watch millennial and Gen Z political attitudes and habits. And in any case, they weren't getting institutionally involved. And we saw them actually running for precinct captains and things like that in significant ways. Here's the breakdown again, exit polls, but it seems to be as accurate as we can tell in this mail-in year and so on. And you can see a unusually high, but not unprecedentedly high break for Biden. This is the national presidential numbers among the under 30 crowd, slight margins in favor as you go on up. And then oldest voters, 65 and up, were slightly favoring Trump. You see a difference in education level, but not as dramatic as is sometimes described. And the fact that no college degree, which Trump won by 4 or 5 percentage points in 2016, is actually a significant feature of this election as well. That's mostly women with no college degree who are making up on the Biden side, men with no college degree voting overwhelmingly for Trump. All right, that gives you the paths for Biden and Trump, a sense of this is typically polarized elections, some demographic details. Let's talk about issues at least for a moment. A lot of claims on election night and even in the weeks leading up that even with the most larger than life figure of Donald Trump running this time, and people basically seeing this as a referendum on him, as exit polls and focus groups and so on are showing again and again, issues seem to matter. Obviously, this is a fuzzy space, but those of us who try to operationalize some of these ideas, issues seem to matter more to people's voting, and maybe no surprise during a pandemic and the resumption or renewal of a major movement for racial equity in the form of Black Lives Matter, which of course also was a major story during this election season. So issues seem to matter. The Times told us right after in one of their main headlines, pandemic versus the economy. All right, let's take a look. They're saying the coronavirus went with Biden, warriors went with Biden, economy folks went with Trump. Maybe so. Interestingly, though, and maybe suggesting that people voting their pocketbooks, or at least voting about the economy and its performance, voted for Trump. Wall Street certainly didn't do that. Every time it looks like Biden ticks up, there is almost a linear relationship between an increase in the stock market and other kinds of market activity. And then those future markets that you all and all of us know to watch, they are in the last 24 hours registering the strongest expectations for Biden we've seen. And so that's probably explaining some of the strong Wall Street numbers since a very turbulent election day, as you can see here in this headline, a Joe Biden bet. Interestingly, I'm going to dive into issues a bit more. This is now Edison's regular exit polls as interpreted, not by me, but by the BBC in this case. Here's the issues that seem to matter as you came out now. This is a prompt question. Here's 5 issues, what mattered most in deciding how you voted. So a little bit of a prompt there, but interesting to see how it breaks out. Let's just go and tie a couple of these points together. Look, when we get to how people thought these issues mattered, how incredibly closely divided we are. The economy, is the economy excellent or good? 48% say yes. Is it not so good or poor? 50% say yes to that. Here you have our 50-50 country. It turns out some kind of independent, objective, rational voter claim about the economy is not all that available. This is not representing, by the way, people who are doing well economically. You'd see a much bigger skew to not so good and poor during the pandemic. What you are seeing here is folks who already have an ideological position, who identify with one or the other party, reporting the view of the economy through that lens. Same thing astonishingly for coronavirus. I was stunned to see these figures, my cherished colleagues. 48% of respondents say US efforts to contain this pandemic are going very well or somewhat well, and 50% say somewhat badly or very badly. Again, where you sit party-wise turns out to be determining where you are on issues. People seem to be voting on these issues, but they are voting party in the same kind of way. So, all right, let's leave the presidential level and so on for a moment, and or for the rest of our time, come first to Congress and state level, including redistricting, and then wrap up with a look at how the pollsters did in this election, including we political scientists who brazenly issue predictions before things come about. Congressional results, you've also got a sense that here we are in 50-50 land again, or in this case, 48-48. I'm here in North Carolina. I do a lot of analysis and pay close attention to the North Carolina race, obviously. Cal Cunningham, probably Tillis will win, but we're still several 100,000 ballots to count, and they keep finding them in post offices and so on. If what's filtering through that there's all these nefarious vote stealing things happening, knowing one of these post offices and the fact that it's just a COVID / overtaxed post office staff error, I can tell you there is no evidence of any kind of vote stealing and fraudulent activity. It's just overwhelmed folks who are getting in ballots when they can get them in. You all know, I guess, that the North Carolina Supreme Court itself said we can continue to receive absentee ballots up till the 12th. So we may not know North Carolina's Senate or presidential outcome for a few days yet. And you can see where the open Senate races are. This Georgia plus Georgia special is fascinating. One of those races already gone to a runoff to be held in January. And as the vote count narrows, the Purdue seat may also wind up in a runoff. So we may not know the outcome of the Senate until not long before Inauguration Day and the new Congress opens for business. So much to say about the Senate, but it's, to me, reflective of our incredibly close nation. House, not as much. This is the formal reported things. Most of these 40 we can assign to one part or the other. The best guess overall is that Democrats will slightly increase their lead in the House. Not a lot of wild flipping activity, but an unusual number of congressional races. Let me say differently, a significant number of congressional races in line, House races, sorry, in line with this polarized period that were razor thin close. As it happens, there's one in Georgia I was watching closely in the Atlanta suburbs. Carolyn Bordeaux, who came close last time, flipped the seat Democratic this time. I mentioned her not because she's some bellwether, but because she was my PhD student. And you got to love when one of your students and a wonderful professor at Georgia State in the political science public administration space, and one of your former students and a political scientist runs for office and wins. That's good news. You all in Oklahoma not unusually bucked the trend of relatively close races. Inhofe won by a mile for Senate, and all 5 of your House races, the margin was enormous. And indeed, your margin for Trump over Biden was 23 points, one of the largest in the country. So Oklahoma is as rock-ribbed red as it comes, which is why if I were living there, I'd be looking elsewhere for exciting races around the country, and partly why I'm bringing you these overall results rather than trying to say things about their particular state. So that's Senate and the House as we know them so far. Again, chances are the Republicans will retain the Senate with a 51-49 margin. If it's 50-50, of course, and Biden wins, you all know how that plays out. And there we are in Congress. State results. This matters more than usual. Of course, we pay close attention to state legislative and gubernatorial races always, but the state legislative races matter most, as I keep telling my students who don't much care about state results in 2020, because that will determine redistricting for the coming decade and all kinds of major benefits and losses that flow from that. And the news here is that actually quite astonishing news. A typical election sees as many as 12 chambers change hands between one party or the other. This time there's almost none. We've got, so again, let me say, if you weren't aware of this, 12 state chambers on average for the last 30 years change party each general election cycle. This time it's 2 so far. The Virginia House and Senate. Actually, well, I'm doing the whole cycle. So Virginia House and Senate shifted in 19 from R to D. New Hampshire, it appears almost certain, as of 2 days ago, has shifted from Democrat to Republican. So it's a net no change. Here's what it looked like before. You can see a very little change. New Hampshire goes red, and that's it for this map. Few states where we don't know yet. Arizona may wind up flipping from R to D. That would change the number slightly, but the basic news for those of you who are Republican Party aligned yourself, you're very happy because Republicans hold 29 of the state's legislative chambers, Democrats just 18. We don't know Arizona yet, but there'll be overwhelming, again, Republican control of redistricting in most of the country as that plays out. There was not much action on the gubernatorial side this time. Only 11 governor races overall, and they were not a big change agent. Much like legislatures, all the incumbents won. Doesn't happen that much in American life these days. And the 2 open seats in Utah and in Montana, the Republican, no surprise, won both reasonably comfortably. Looked like a shot in Montana for Democrats, but didn't play out that way. 2 states, we saw Republicans take over all 3, both assembly or legislative chambers plus governor. They have 23 states they now control all 3 elective bodies in. Democrats control 15. And then 11 are divided government. So just to give you that flavor, the biggest takeaway here, of course, is about redistricting and the fact that Republicans stay firmly in control. If there'd been a blue wave, as lots of folks were predicting beforehand, either out of wishful thinking or because the numbers told them that, we did not see that materialize in the least. So as in this past decade, redistricting is firmly in Republican hands in a significant majority of states. All right, on then to the polling results. You've already seen some of the headlines that this is a pretty bad year, it turns out. I've done a little polling work myself. We write a lot about it and By the People. I have some sympathy, frankly, in fact, enormous sympathy for the folks who were really wrong in 2016 and vowed to do better this time and built in all kinds of filters and oversampling Republicans and trying to find Republican shy Trump voters and put them in his column and so on. But it was pretty off as well. I don't think it's quite as bad as this headline from a Federalist, which is a news outlet on the right. But wow, that's refuses to say whether he'll resign. So this is a tough business polling. We had things to a pretty refined science some set of decades ago, and it's these last 2 elections, particularly at the national level, have thrown things into disarray. I'm going to close with this and thrilled to go to the chat and or take questions however it makes most sense. But I do want to note how we political scientists did. And PS always provides a few days before the election, those political scientists willing to go on record. I'm not sure how you get on those lists, but as providing a prediction. We actually don't know who's right and who's wrong yet, but we do know that Biden will win the popular vote. There's no way Trump can catch up. He's 3 million behind, 3.5 million behind the popular vote. Biden will have a larger margin than did Hillary Clinton, it looks like, over Trump. I would note, by the way, that one interesting feature of our otherwise 50-50 nation is that this means Democrats will have won 7 of the last 8 popular vote elections, which is, for better or worse, for what it's worth, the longest or the largest such success of any 8 presidential election period in US history. No party has ever won 7 out of 8 popular votes in an election sequence. So interesting feature there. Of our table 2 folks, most of them have Biden as the winner. Biden looks like he'll wind up somewhere in the 51 to 52% range, if I've done the math right. 72 over 68.5, now up to 72.3. They're still counting. So, there's some folks came reasonably close to nailing it, at least The state by state predictors did. Those two who thought Trump would win the popular vote, I give them courage for their convictions. Lockerbie especially, he issues his predictions very early, as only has a couple keys for those of you who follow this. He only does the popular vote, doesn't do the electoral college. He has a couple keys. He's very faithful to those, and he's going to be way off on popular vote as he was last time. But he's been a good predictor before. As you see up top on the first one, we don't know the electoral college outcome yet, but man, these predictions are all over the place. Normally, Jim and I run this table in our book each time, and I've gone back to look to where political scientists were issuing predictions starting in the 90s in a significant number, and they usually cleave much more closely to one another. I'm glad there's a whole array of models because we're pretty well off in these overall. All right, I've said a lot. I'm really excited to hear what you all think and how you'd like to help characterize and contextualize this election. Let me stop sharing so I can both see the chat and your faces. And there's Michael Mosher. How awesome. How long since I've seen you, my friend. Shannon, what's the best way to approach? Should I take the chat questions one by one? Why don't you pose them and I'll answer as you see fit.
That sounds good. I'm gotta say that I'm really excited to see these updates in the book as they come. We've been using the textbook for about 6 years now. I think I might be one of the few people who have read that book more than you, as much as you have, or nearly. I've got it cover to cover over and over. But and this will be a nice addition to that is coming out in January.
Well, it has changed on every page, and on almost every sentence has changed this time around. So,
well, I do have a slide that I really like to show my students from the publication just prior to 2016 about what sorts of politicians typically win and how that all changed in 2016. I tell my students I'm never taking this out of my slides because we need to have historical context from the previous book. So Tony asks, to a layperson, it appears the pollsters were way off. What needs to be done to fix this moving forward?
Wow, it's a powerful and, for anybody involved in the polling world, cringeworthy question, because it felt like a lot of fixes took place, particularly when we political scientists were doing it, and also, of course, when the professionals were doing it. Nate Silver with his 40,000 simulations and so on across a whole array of ways polls were taken. Yeah, you'd think we'd be getting better and better. We've certainly improved since polling was born after the botched 1936 Literary Digest mail in your card, and they ran a thing of their readers saying that Franklin Roosevelt would lose in a landslide when in fact he won with one of the largest popular vote margins in history. Folks got serious after that about scientific polling, and you can track a convergence on close to the actual outcome that goes, with a few exceptions. 2000, there were some misses and the like, but we've really gotten it wrong or those who do this work have really gotten it wrong in recent years. I see Tony also asked about the shy Trump voter.
Yeah.
Most folks think that people are not bald-facedly lying to pollsters. They could be wrong, but there's really, a shy Trump voter is a nice way of saying Trump voters are liars. Now, there's folks who refuse to respond to pollsters on principle, but remarkably, in a cell phone and Zoom age, most people, when called, when actually reached on the phone, are Americans love to give their opinions. So what you don't have is a whole lot of people who might be voting for Trump not willing to respond. What you also don't seem to have on either side is Trump or Biden voters are liars. Again, I'm going to put that starkly, but it's really what a shy voter suggests. Now, of course, if supporters on both sides lied to pollsters about their vote intention, the lying would cancel out. You wouldn't see a bias. So what this shy Trump voter theory is really a Trump voters are liars theory. They're lying to pollsters on purpose, deliberately. And we don't have a lot of evidence for that. In fact, I don't want to get too wonky down the weeds, but last time around, many of this in 2016, we just don't know the results as well this time, so it's hard to speak definitively. But in 2016, the final average of Hillary winning the popular vote was 3-ish, and she won by 2 and change. Polling averages were way off in a handful of states, not all over the country, but in Iowa, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin. I think those were the four where the polls were really off. Also Minnesota, where Clinton barely won and was supposed to win by a lot. So what we've now done, those of you who are still following this tortured logic, is saying that Trump voting liars exist in a handful of states only, not in the whole country. People in Oklahoma tell the truth to pollsters. People in North Carolina tell the truth. But in these Midwestern states, they're liars. And actually, I just have a very hard time understanding why that is. In fact, a shy Trump voter theory makes the most sense in states where the small number of Trump voters are surrounded by Clinton voters, or this time around, Trump voters are surrounded by Biden. So California should be way off, for example. Oregon, states that have a large margin. But you don't see that. You see very close to the actual popular vote outcomes in many states. What probably happened last time around in 2016 is pollsters didn't pick up enough non-college educated voters. So they didn't see the magnitude of the surge. As it happens in those same Midwest states I just mentioned, where the polling was particularly off, they actually have among the largest population of white voters without a college education per capita, proportion of the whole state population in the country. So that is probably what explains the shy voters last time. Believe me, there is not a pollster on the planet worth their salt and so on this time who didn't oversample white voters without college educations. They veered to fix it. And yet it looks like we were off again this time. Not all over the place, but again in some states. So something else happened. Everybody weighted their data on educational attainment this time through. In fact, actually, as I showed you a little while ago, the education gap, so to speak, those with a college education versus those without, was not nearly as big as it was in 2016. So we just don't know yet about why the pollsters were off this time. But the idea that in a few states, there's a bunch of Trump liars, again, folks who are going to vote for Trump but lie to pollsters, it didn't actually work out that way last time, and I suspect it won't wind up that way this time either. Real question to ask, I guess, is, how much does it matter if the pollsters are wrong? There's something that all of us, I guarantee, have said in class to our students, particularly young students who might be voting for the first time. If you teach an intro American government course, you've got some first years and second years in there. And we tell them again and again that campaigns actually matter. There's these predictors who say the economy will tell you, or the something will tell you, or the this will tell you. And actually the way campaigns run, it's an article of faith about my students. When I open my mouth to talk about elections, they nod and say, yes, we know campaigns matter. And I think that's what happened this time again, as we start to get the final results in and start to really work through what happened state by state. I think we'll understand where the pollsters were off, and it will be a different place where they were off last time.
Do you think that pollsters are going to have a hard time in 2024 having any legitimacy from the media and those that are covering it, political analysts, or do you think that people will say, prove us that you're correct next time, and then we'll rely on you in 2028?
Well, I like that idea somehow, but the main commissioners of polls, i.e. the folks who spend the most money on polling, besides candidates themselves, and those are internal polls, which you don't usually see, and this are leaking a favorable result, are the media outlets themselves. And the big networks, most of the big polls we all follow, apart from the occasional idiosyncratic, ordinary pollster turned national hero or goat like Nate Silver, they're mostly ABC News, Washington Post, and so on across. So, hard for them to say, well, we're just not going to trust ourselves this time. So I can't imagine that changing, although it's a tempting idea. I like it.
David asks, assuming the 270 to 268 scenario were to occur, how much risk is there of faithless electors changing the result?
So that's a fabulous and really important question. And I'm going to share my screen again, if that's okay, because Yeah, the answer is nobody knows. That's the short answer. We aren't often in a space in American life, although elections are close. We're usually not in these electoral vote margin is so close that the way the electors get cast, state certified, and so on will make a difference. So I'm going to share my screen. This is a tool I'm hoping we can add to the book. It's done by a buddy of mine at the Miller Center at UVA. I'm going to ask that you not copy it and tweet it because they're still tweaking it themselves, but it's a really valuable resource. Can you guys see it? Thumbs. Wow, Tony, if Biden wins and I was an advisor, what does he do in the first 90 days? It's a wonderful question. And I'm an elections junkie. I'm also a policy junkie, but I've been so stuck in this election, I can't, my head up high enough high to say anything about that. Biden put together what I think is a terrific transition team. And I want to say terrific in this sense, knowledgeable public administrators and experienced elected officials for the most part. Also, though, it really is a kind of a team of rivals. I don't know if you all follow these who's on Biden's possible transition teams as obsessively as me, but for example, I think of AOC, notorious or beloved left-wing congresswoman, as notorious or beloved as you may see the case. AOC was a very sharp critic of Biden and, helped Bernie out a fair bit when it looked like Bernie was actually going to, it's not that long ago that most of us election watchers declared Biden dead after his terrible performances in Iowa, New Hampshire, and Arizona, and Nevada, as I recall, and South Carolina proved his turning point, but by a much just more greater decisive nature than anybody thought. But AOC was a Biden supporter, and a strong critic of Biden. At one point, she said publicly, in any other country but this, Joe Biden and I wouldn't even be in the same party. In other words, our policy differences are that great. And she was particularly displeased with his climate change, anything around her and colleagues' Green New Deal legislative proposals. Joe Biden could easily have uttered an epithet and never spoken to her again. It was one of a series of pretty sharp shots across his bow. Instead, once he got his support congealed around him and received the nomination and began to set up transition team possibilities. You need to do this ahead of time. He invited that same Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to be the head of his transition team working through climate change policy. I find that a really interesting signal. Not that Biden will hand over his major policy decisions to the left wing of the party. There's other people on that committee who, AOC wouldn't get along with, nor does she claim she get along with Biden. But he put really interesting groups where there's been apparently really lively debates. I know a couple folks who are involved, and from everything we hear, they're hammering out some, kind of apropos of the moment, interestingly innovative third way, i.e., not this relatively stale, not so much third way being it's not Republican or Democratic, but more within each party, Democrats in this case, if Biden wins, this sector of the party is disagreeing or taking this policy position, this sector takes this position. Some really interesting blends seem to be coming out. So long way of saying, Tony, he needs to set some significant policy priorities, needs to pick a couple signatures. I think a stimulus will be first out of the gate. That's frankly why Wall Street finds his possible victory encouraging. They are betting on some significant stimulus action, and that seems almost certain to be a major move. Should Republicans retain the Senate and Biden take the presidency, my guess is McConnell will back away from a resistance to any kind of stimulus. Didn't want to do it in the waning days, but Trump was kind of all over the place about it, as you all know. So I think that'll be a major thing out of the gate. And I do think some kind of environmental/climate change attempt. Now, that will be much harder to get past a Republican Senate, even if it's just a 51-49 margin. We all know, and we teach our classes, it's really a 60 vote margin, thanks to the filibuster. And unless McConnell, for some reason, removes it, he's going to be able to block almost anything Biden wants to do from a majority position. So I'd say in the first 90 days, respond to this continuing pandemic alarm with a meaningful stimulus and try to get some other legislative priority queued up while there's something of a halo or honeymoon. help a lot, of course, if the Senate were Democratic, but that doesn't seem like it'll be the case. Well, I've talked a lot. I hope this has been useful and interesting, and what a joy to have this time with each of you.
It has certainly been useful and interesting, and we really appreciate you taking the time to share with us. This has been very interesting, and I appreciate that you spoke beyond just the presidential election and the interesting components about the state legislatures and the governor's races. And this was to a group of people who live for this. This has continued to be very interesting and provide new information. I have pulled up the New York Times, and we have no more information about the outcome of the election than when we started. So at least that opportunity was not robbed from you mid presentation, and so we will be continuing to look through this. So thank you for clarifying so much, and this is a great opportunity. These recordings will be available after the conference, and I know that my students will be reviewing this after the conference, and even have an extra credit opportunity to kind of help and have an opportunity to make more sense of these things. So thank you so much for your time, and we would like to have you back in Oklahoma anytime.
I look forward to being there in person, truly.
Well, great. Well, everybody enjoy the next talk, and thank you for being here.
And last thing I'm going to say is what a joy that you all are holding a political science conference amid this pandemic. The North Carolina equivalent of this group, we canceled at least our spring gathering, and I think that's when we usually do it. So we'll see what happens next spring. But I love that you guys went forward with this, and what an honor to get to join you for part of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Farewell.
Bye.